the standards of the previous papers, which I apologise, but I hope it's not entirely devoid of serious interest. As the title of my talk suggests, there are two features of the mind which have most generally been thought to constitute problems for materialism. These are its capacity for thought and its possession of consciousness. In classical and medieval philosophy, opposition to materialism rested principally on the difficulty of providing a materialist understanding of thought. Plato believed the intellect immaterial because the forms are immaterial and the intellect has an affinity with the forms it apprehends. Aristotle did not believe in Platonic forms, and he propounded a more discursive case than Plato's for the immateriality of thought. He held that the intellect was immaterial because if it were material, it could not receive all forms. Just as the eye, because of its particular physical nature, is sensitive to light but not to sound, and the ear to sound and not to light, so if the intellect were in a physical organ, it could be sensitive only to a restricted range of physical things. Well, this is not the case, for we can think about any kind of material object. This, I think, remained the crucial philosophical objection to materialism throughout the Middle Ages, and it certainly is fundamental in Aquinas, as you all know. Little is made of Aristotle's argument as it stands nowadays, and for fairly obvious reasons. But his views on intellect are paralleled by certain contemporary worries about the physicalization of our intellectual capacities. In general terms, Aristotle's worry was that a material organ could not have the range and flexibility that we ascribe to human thought. His worries concerned the cramping effect that matter would have on the range of objects that intellect could accommodate. Modern concerns center on the restriction which matter would impose on the range of rational processes that we could exhibit. Gödel, for example, believed that his famous theorem showed that there are demonstrably rational forms of mathematical thought of which humans are capable, which could not be exhibited by a mechanical or formal system of the sort one might think that a physical mind would have to be. And more recently, Penrose argued that Turing's halting problem has similar consequences. In fact, the sheer physicality of a system seems to impose two interconnected restrictions on its ability to think. First, there is a rigidity of performance. Second, it is the difficulty a physicalist framework has in accommodating semantics, intentionality, and meaning. The first problem is exemplified in Gödel's and Turing's worries about formal systems. A more accessible version of this is well set out by Daniel Dennett, rather surprisingly. He cites the case of the wasp Sphex. It performs a fixed ritual when bringing food back to its nest. It first leaves the food outside the nest and enters to check on its eggs, then returns outside to bring in the food. This appears to be intelligent behavior, but if the food is moved slightly while the wasp is in the nest, it will replace the food in its original position and recheck the eggs. If the food is moved again, the whole process will be repeated, and so on. By interrupting the ritual constantly, one could lock the wasp in a circle of incompleted rituals, which you perform until it drops from exhaustion. Sphex does not have the nous to see that it need not recheck the eggs. The trouble with Sphex is that the ritual in question is hardwired into the system, giving it no flexibility. Such unresponsiveness to the environment is incompatible with intelligence. And a physical organism could be much more environmentally sensitive than Sphex. But if we are just thinking machines, then some degree of Spexishness must infect our behavior, though no doubt at a much more sophisticated level. The restriction is endemic to the implementation of a procedure by a system constrained by physical causation. Only a creature whose operation was ultimately teleological would not be at the mercy of the rigidities implicit in any mechanical realization of a design. Dennett himself plays down this residual spexishness that we suffer from, arguing that an organism as sophisticated as a human being approximates as near as one could desire to genuine rationality. How this response misses the point is shown by the second restriction physicality imposes on thought, namely the difficulty it creates for semantics, intentionality, and meaning. This difficulty is the source of spexishness. As Dennett says, an intelligent physical system can only be a syntactic engine, not a semantic one. By this he means that, for a physicalist, any causal powers that a sign possesses, symbol, must be entirely due to its properties, its physical properties, such as its size, shape, and mass, and not to its meaning. The semantic content of a state does not as such have any causal role. This is the explanation of why we are, in Dennett's phrase, a little bit spexish. But Dennett is not worried by this, because it is no shock to find that we are ever so slightly imperfectly rational, he says. But this misses the point. What a sophisticated syntactic engine ever so slightly fails to do is mimic a perfectly semantic engine. It does not just fail to be a perfect semantic engine, it fails to be semantic at all, as is shown by its revealing, though well-disguised, trivial failures of performance. If you believe that human rationality is in some way semantically driven, depending on what our psychological states mean, not just on their physical contours, then a physicalist model of thought will not be possible. If Spex understood what it was trying to do, and if understanding is not a mere epiphenomenon, then there would always be the possibility of a radical modification of behavior. It seems to me that as a sort of parallel, one objection to physicalism, which of a kind we're going to come on to, is that pain is not just a functional state or a disposition to react. You react because of what it feels like. Well, I think when you start asking me questions, it won't be a question of a physical effect on you just of this sound waves inputs doing something to your brain. You'll think you know what I meant. And you'll ask me the questions on the basis of what you think I meant, not on the basis of some purely realization of the system, any more than it's a pure realization of the system when it comes to pain. It's the subjective side and the other side, the intellectual side. This point is appreciated by Dennett himself in a way when he gives an account of the so-called frame problem. Now this is on the handout. There's quite a long quotation there, but I'll read quickly the first couple of paragraphs. Once upon a time there was a robot named R1 by its creators. Its only task was to fend for itself. One day its designers arranged for it to learn that its spare batteries, its precious energy supply was locked in a room with a time bomb set to go off soon. R1 located the room and the key to the door and formulated a plan to rescue its battery. There was a wagon in the room and the battery was on the wagon, so R1 hypothesized that a certain action, which he called pull out wagon room, would result in the battery being removed from the room. Straight away it acted, and it did succeed in getting the battery out of the room before the bomb went off. Unfortunately, however, the bomb was also on the wagon. R1 knew that the bomb was on the wagon in the room, but didn't realize that pulling the wagon would bring the bomb out along with the battery. Poor R1 had missed the obvious implications of its planning act. Then you go into another regime trying to allow for that kind of thing. And at the bottom of the page, back to the drawing board. We must teach it the difference between relevant implications and irrelevant implications, said the designers, and teach it to ignore the relevant ones. So they developed a method of doing that, and the same problems keep arising. Now, the frame problem is sometimes treated as a purely formal one in construing a program which enables the machine to distinguish relevant from irrelevant considerations. As a formal problem, some solutions have been forthcoming, I believe. But it's easy to see the source of the difficulty is that the machine cannot think teleologically, that it cannot think in terms of what it is trying to do, because it cannot think in terms of the meaning or the point of the act. This point is hardly different from Jerry Fodor's when he says in The Mind Does Not Work That Way, that computational theories cannot handle abduction. You can do enumerative induction and deduction, but you can't do abduction at all, which involves seeing the point of what one is trying to do or explain and seeing which solution best fits this. Only a semantic engine, only an engine which understands what it's trying to do, rather than has got purely formal instructions, can possibly do that. This is also related to Searle's famous Chinese room argument. You know the story. He's in his room manipulating what are in fact Chinese symbols, though he doesn't know that, according to a rule book of instructions, without knowing what any of it means. But this is all, Searle says, rightly, a computer or any physical machine can do. They, that is, therefore, do not understand and hence do not think. They're simply going through a rule-followed performance, moving symbols as a syntactic machine without understanding what they're doing. But how and why does Searle know that he doesn't understand Chinese? Why does he not think that he is understanding it with the help of some extended mind apparatus? It can only be because he can know introspectively when and what he is understanding. And he can tell that he is not understanding at that moment, or through the whole process. Perhaps there is a sense in which Searle's Chinese room argument is what led to the more recent belief in cognitive phenomenology. I don't think there's any actual connection there, but it's a natural connection to make. If you think that Searle really didn't understand Chinese, or Searle in the room, he's performing as if he did, it can only be because he knows jolly well that he doesn't understand what these things say. And if you know by introspection whether you understand what things are saying, then there must be a cognitive phenomenology. Must be something in the experience whereby you know it. So even if Searle didn't play a role in this, and I suspect in some way he did as a background, if nothing else, it could well have, it should have done, so to speak. We can tell when and what we are understanding because we are conscious of it, just as certainly as we are in the case of sensations. So what I'm trying to show is that the traditional view that thought can be handled behaviorally or functionally has collapsed as clearly as the behaviorist functionalist theory of sensation, which we won't go on to. But there's more work to be done, I think, in spelling out and developing this failure. It's not been as, there's nothing quite as solid as the knowledge argument, as it were, in the thought case. But the intuitions are not that different. So there's still, as it were, mileage in the classical problem. And we shouldn't be deceived by the tradition that comes from Ryle, that the behavioral functional stuff will do for the thinking. I think when the earlier phenomenologists like Searle thought that thought was a clear case of something where there was a phenomenology of what you were doing. It's only in a certain empiricist tradition where they said, oh, we can't deal with raw fields, but we can deal with the rest, that this situation arose. So let us leave thought behind for the moment and turn to sensations, the perceptual side of things. The locus classicus for how this constitutes a problem for physicalism has become to be the knowledge argument, on which I have a book which came out this week. You can find in Cambridge University Press, except unless you're going to take out a new mortgage, you won't be able to afford it. Borrow it from somebody. You know the story. This is again, I think, I hope. Yeah. Mary is confined to a black and white room, is educated through black and white books, and through lectures relayed on black and white television. In this way, she learns everything there is to know about the physical nature of the world. She knows all the physical facts about us and our environment. In a wide sense of physical, that includes everything in completed physics, chemistry, neurophysiology, and all there is to know about the causal and relational facts consequent upon all this, including, of course, functional roles. This is Frank Jackson. If physicalism is true, she knows all there is to know. But to suppose otherwise is to suppose there is more to know than every physical fact, and that is just what physicalism denies. It seems, however, that Mary does not know all there is to know. For when she is let out of the black and white room or given colour television, she will learn what it is like to see something red, say. This is rightly described as learning. She will not say ho-hum. I don't know why you can't say ho-hum when you learn something. Ho-hum, that's what it's like, is it? Oh, why not? Anyway, hence physicalism is false. As stated, the argument presents itself as an argument for property dualism. This is a contrast, in a sense, with the thought argument, which is more about a capacity or process rather than a specific set of properties. What follows now, Tim, Kotick and Robert will have heard in Budapest for the next bit, but Tim said I could jump back, so. I want to say something about the knowledge argument, which is not just defending it against the standard objections, but suggesting that it has a range and a power which is greater than what is normally thought. The dialectical situation in which the knowledge argument for property dualism is usually taken to be located is the following. It is taken as agreed that physicalism gives an adequate account of non-conscious reality, and that this part of reality constitutes almost 100% of the universe. But despite this overwhelming success, however, the physicalist account struggles to accommodate certain features of mental life, namely what it is like, or qualia, of certain conscious states. These qualia constitute the qualitative nature of sensations and probably of secondary qualities, but have nothing to do with our robust conception of the physical as it applies to the vast, mindless tracts of reality. These awkward entities constitute what Chalmers called the hard problem for physicalism. But the fact that they also constitute such a tiny part of the world is implicitly understood as being a strong prima facie reason for thinking there must be some way of reconciling their apparent existence with the otherwise triumphant and clearly adequate physicalist account of the world. If it were not for the qualia that occur in a few corners of reality, the adequacy of physicalism would not in any way be in dispute. And that's, I think, what led Frank Jackson to apostatize and to decide he had to give up on his arguments for very strange reasons. I mean, in detail, strange reasons. His general motivation is clear. I think this interpretation of the situation constitutes a radical misunderstanding of and understatement of the problem that faces physicalism and the role that the knowledge argument plays in bringing about that problem, bringing out that problem. The dialectic is quite different from the way it is represented in what I've just said. To see why and how this is so, one must direct attention at our conception of matter and the physical, rather than at our concept of mind. Science, whether of the macroscopic or the microscopic, is very largely concerned with measurement and quantification, and with the expression of its findings in mathematics, physics, as far as is possible. But the resultant abstract, we might call it Platonistic, conception of the physical cannot, we think, wholly capture our concept of the physical, especially as it is conceived in our naive or commonsensical conception of the world, manifest image of the common sense world. Taken in this abstract, more or less mathematical form, the concept of the physical is insufficiently concrete. But what concretizes it is the addition of qualities, essentially sensible qualities, that figure so importantly in our naive or commonsensical conception of the world. These are essential to our ability to cache or model or interpret the abstract mathematical conception. Physicalism's real predicament, as it's been brought out by the knowledge argument, can be represented in two propositions, also on the handout. Standard physicalism cannot capture the qualitative nature or aspect of reality. And two, the qualitative is an essential feature of any conception of the physical that goes beyond the purely abstract and mathematically expressed. These two together entail that standard physicalism cannot capture any conception of the physical that goes beyond the purely abstract or mathematically expressed. This, of course, is a much stronger conclusion than that which the normal understanding of the hard problem attributes to the knowledge argument, namely, for standard physicalism cannot capture the qualitative nature of certain mental states. On my reinterpretation of the situation, what the knowledge argument really shows is one, standard physicalism cannot capture the qualitative nature or aspect of reality. It takes two, the qualitative is an essential part of our ordinary conception of the physical, to be independently plausible, possibly analytically true, and probably largely uncontested or unnoticed. 1 and 2 together show that standard physicalism is not merely incomplete, failing to cope with consciousness, but something more like incoherent, because it cannot give a coherent account of the physical itself. In what follows, I'll show that the knowledge argument, if sound, proves that physicalism cannot capture the qualitative. I'll justify that claim that I make in 1. Yeah. So extending the scope of the knowledge argument. So the knowledge argument, as traditionally stated, appears to concern only the nature of mental states. This appearance has two factors. First, the argument concerns what it is like to have certain experiences. This expression clearly names something subjective. This alone is not enough to combine the topic to the mental world. One is talking about what it is like, if one is talking about what it is like to feel pain or jealousy, then this might seem to be purely internal. But what it is like to see colour or to hear sound is directly connected with our notion of what colour is like or what sound is like, as those things are, or as we naively conceive them to be, in the external world. There's irony here. It's a feature of the accounts of many physicalists, the accounts they present of experience, that experience is transparent. This means that the only feature that characterizes the experience qua experience is the apparent presence of some objective or external property. So what it is like to experience red or C sharp is no different from what red is like or what C sharp is like. This transparency of secondary qualities, however, is not enough to show that the knowledge argument concerns our conception of the external or physical world, because the qualities that are invoked, as I've just put it, are the secondary qualities. And at least since Locke, it's standard within the scientific form of physical realism to treat secondary qualities, insofar as they are not just powers or dispositions, but are monadic qualities, as subjective. I'm not going too fast, am I? No. This leaves the physical world untouched. Well, that is characterized wholly by primary qualities, it will be argued. Once one has reached this point, however, it ought to be becoming clear why the argument does not concern secondary qualities alone. Red maybe is defined in terms of what it is like to perceive it, square is not. But someone's conception of square is not independent of what it is like for them to perceive, see, touch, or some other possible sense, square things. But if it were, it would be wholly axiomatic and mathematical. It would be, as it were, a geometry without any pictures. Using Sellers' convenient terminology, I think Sellers is awful, but this distinction is quite useful. Our manifest image of the world is a projection of what it is like to perceive it, in respect of both primary and secondary qualities. The secondary qualities are attached to a particular form of experience. The primary are not to a particular form of experience. But without any experience, in our case visual or tactile or both, there will be no conception of spatial properties beyond the wholly mathematical. What the knowledge argument really brings out is that only experience of the appropriate kind can reveal the qualitative as opposed to purely formal and structural features of the world. What the standard modern physicalist fails to notice is that the kind of thing that Jackson's Mary did not know, generalized from colour vision to all other sensible qualities, is essential to any contentful conception of the world, and hence that physicalism without it would lack any empirical content. The generalization of the knowledge argument can be expressed as follows, again on the handout. Take any property P, which is a quality or has a qualitative aspect. then it will be true of any subject S who has no experiential grasp on that qualitative aspect, but otherwise has full knowledge of all matters relating to P, that S lacks knowledge of P's qualitative aspect. I call this the generalization of the argument, but one might with equal justice say that it's the principle underlying the argument. The thought experiment merely makes this clear, rather in the way that the drawing of the geometrical proof makes it clear. It's not essential. It's vital to appreciate that this rationale applies to primary qualities as much as to secondary. The fact that it is easier to describe a thought experiment in which someone has experience like ours, except that chromatic colour is missing, or perhaps that they're deaf, than it is to imagine experience like ours without spatial features, if that's possible at all, doesn't affect the fact that an empirically contentful, as opposed to a purely formal or axiomatic, conception of space depends on visual or tactile or some other experience of a spatial field to give us a conception of space which might be what space might be empirically like, and that this is dependent on what it is like to perceive it in some particular way. Strawson and individuals argue that a purely auditory universe would not be enough to generate a conception of space, however the sounds were managed and organized. Whether he's right in thinking hearing alone could not generate a conception of space isn't something we now need to consider. For what matters for present purposes is that whether or not there could be a purely auditory and genuinely spatial world, we certainly can make prima facie a sense of a mind with auditory experience, where the sounds in it were organized in a way which could not sustain a conception of space, and which lacked any other senses that might be sufficient to contribute a sense of space. That's rather clumsily put. All I'm saying there is, just imagine a creature that doesn't have any of the spatial senses, but it can hear, and then somebody starts talking to it. The sounds it hears are simply those, say, of verbal discourse. If such a mind could be taught verbally all the proofs of geometry and of relativity theory, it seems clear that its resultant grasp on the nature of empirical space will be no better than Mary's on colour. This mind would have a purely scientific or formal conception in a way that did not guarantee he would have any concept of what space was or might be like in itself or qualitatively. I want to emphasize that any worries one might have about whether there could be such a mind, as this is not the point. The prima facie intelligibility of the suggestion is enough to bring out the point that our conception of primary qualities as more than purely formal is not independent of what it is like to experience them. So though the knowledge argument is most easily stated in terms of secondary qualities, which are seemingly easily relegated into the dustbin of the mind, the principle of the argument can be carried through for primary qualities that are fundamental to our conception of physical reality. Our conception of these at bottom is no more independent of what it's like to perceive them than is our conception of the secondary qualities. I say at bottom because, of course, you're not dependent on one sense as you are with secondary qualities, but still you are dependent. And our own experience, in fact, bears this out. I suggested above that a mind with no spatial experience could not gain a better than abstract conception of space on the basis of learning geometry, relativity theory, and the like. Well, this is not so far from our situation, insofar as our own grasp on 4 and more spatial dimensions, or on relativistic or bent space, is not purely mathematical. It depends on trying imaginatively to extend the 2 and 3 dimensions of which we have actual experience. This attempt is only very limitedly successful. We do not really achieve a grasp on what 4 or 5 dimensions or other spatial exotica that go beyond experience could actually be like. The narrative of Flatland, a story written at the beginning of the 20th century, I think, makes plausible the thought that creatures that lived in 2 dimensions would have a similar difficulty to the one we have with more than 3 dimensions in giving imaginative content to 3 dimensions. In none of these cases is the problem a lack of theoretical knowledge. It's a lack of the kind of experience which could give interpretation to that knowledge. The correct way of looking at the rationale of the knowledge argument is to see it as granting content to the physicalist hypothesis only for purposes of argument. Even if we grant, it says, that physicalism could cope with the rest of reality, it still cannot cope with what it is like to experience things. But once one recognizes the connection between what it is like to experience the world and what we can conceive the world we experience to be like, one can see that if physicalism cannot capture the former, it cannot capture the latter. One cannot have an adequate conception of the physical which does not include those physical qualitative components that are the transparent projections of the qualitative nature of experience. Seen in this way, it begins to look as if the knowledge argument cannot fail to be right. For if there were not some special kind of content that is revealed only in experience, then we would not have an empirically significant conception of the physical in the first place. So if you are tempted to think that physicalism might somehow be able to diffuse the intuition that Mary learned something substantive and new, you need only direct your attention to the way that any non-formal conception of the physical is dependent upon the qualitative nature of reality as revealed uniquely in experience, to see that this could not possibly be true, that you can reduce Mary to some other independent notion of the physical. If in general the acquisition of experience did not teach something new, then a purely descriptive account of reality ought not to lack anything essential. In sum, the argument draws attention to the fact that a physicalism that depends on a notion of the physical that is somehow independent of the qualitative nature of experience can only present us with a world that is so formal as to be empirically contentless. So not merely does the knowledge argument show that sensation is not physical, it shows that our conception of the physical world is saturated, so to speak, with the immateriality of the mental. Can we bring the two arguments, that from thought and that from sensation, together? Or are they just two quite separate features of mind? This you didn't hear in your address. Both at odds with materialism, but quite separate. Many writers seem to treat the divide between conceptual activity and perception or sensation as an absolute one. David Smith, for example, says, what's on my handout, concepts are simply irrelevant to perception as such. But when I say that concepts are irrelevant to perception, what I mean is that they are irrelevant to what it is that makes any sensory state a perception at all. They are irrelevant to the intentionality of perception, to its basic world directedness. I think that this insistence on the absoluteness of the divide has at least three sources. One is Aristotle's division between the intellectual and perceptual souls, which seems to suggest that these functions are absolutely different. Another is the theological need to maintain the exclusiveness of immortality to the human soul and associating this immortality with the intellect, not with perceptual consciousness. A third, more subtle source, and the more operative in modern philosophy, I think, comes from a quite different direction, and that's nominalism and its associated reductive approach to the intellect. Now, I'm not at the moment going to say anything about the theological reason, and the first is not without its uncertainties, because Aristotle describes both thought and perception as receiving a form without the matter. We'll see later how this is important, but the role of nominalism is what I want to look at first. There seems to me to be a weak and strong form of conceptualization. By the weak form, I emphatically don't mean something called a merely behavioral or dispositional or functional sense of thought. That's not a conceptualization at all as far as I'm concerned. Nothing purely behavioral counts as conceptualization or thought. Any mental item that is genuinely conceptual must involve an irreducible grasping of a universal in some form. The distinction I wish to draw is between grasping a universal as it presents itself in a sensory or quasi-sensory imagistic form, and grasping it where it no longer depends on a sensory medium or instantiation of its apprehension. For example, as linguistic meaning, or in pure thought, if there is such. So, in the latter, stronger sense of conceptualization, It's intimately connected with that sense of thought where thought happens naturally in the absence of instances of the universals that constitute its content. In the weaker form, there is still a grasping of universals, like animals, but they cannot be handled with the freedom and flexibility that thought in absence allows. This is where nominalism is relevant. If you regard consciousness itself, whenever it involves even the slightest element of recognition, however fleeting, as involving the apprehension of a universal in re, then you will see the world as already, in a sense, conceptualized for us and apprehended as such. Put in another jargon, if perception is the reception of form, then it is at least proto-conceptual. If you're a nominalist, on the other hand, universals only enter in at the point at which a fairly sophisticated kind of mental activity comes into play. It seems that this is far too intellectual a level to be essential to animal perception. Yeah. This, I think, is also the way of undermining the, in my view, wholly mistaken distinction between the space of causes and the space of reasons derived from Sellers that McDowell and co. use. The beginning of Sellers' empiricism and philosophy of mind, he does suggest this as a response to his problem or something like it, and that's when the article becomes unintelligible. He has all sorts of convoluted things against it from that point on, but it seems to me that this is a perfectly straightforward response. I also think that it's possible to argue that the knowledge argument itself entails the irreducibility and hence immateriality of the most fundamental level of thought, namely recognition. There's a tradition among empiricists to try and say, as I said earlier, sensation, okay, irreducible, all thought, purely functional or purely behavioral or purely associative, something of that sort. Forget that. And attempts to develop the ideas of this sort that he finds in Peirce, in his book on the pragmatists. Any form of logical atomism of a Humean kind will tend to develop in this kind of way. But I argue that recognition of objects of awareness, that is, bringing them under concepts, cannot be given a behavioral analysis unless perceptual awareness or functional analysis could be so analysed as well. The knowledge argument shows that that can't be done. They can't give a physicalist analysis of the sensation. But if recognition is susceptible to a reductive treatment, then then neither is concept possession. For recognition is a case of exercising a concept. Once such a breach in the reductive account of intellectual activity has been created, there will be no motive for pursuing such an account of thought. The argument for this is as follows. Let's assume a non-reductive theory of awareness, but some functional behavioral theory of recognition is the case. In this case, the standard situation will be tripart as follows on the third side of your handout. When you have a perception, you could either go an objectless F causing an experience with F in it in some sense, giving rise to an F disposition, where the disposition is supposedly the recognition because it's a functionally understood and cognitive state. But supposing you had F object G experience and F disposition, or even F object no experience F disposition. If it was recognitionally the same to you in all three cases, the centerpiece would become irrelevant. You would in fact have a situation rather like, just as Sellers said one useful thing, Wittgenstein said one useful thing, the beetle in the box case, where does it make any difference whether there's anything in the box at all? Well, if you've got a reductive account of basic recognition, there's no job being done by the apparent presence of a private sensation. The knowledge argument and other things show that you jolly well do need such phenomena, so you better have a non-reductive account of the basic recognition as it is. And that's not surprising because it's recognition of something of a certain kind, and therefore is a form of conceptualization, and it's as fundamental as perception is in a certain sense. I could say more, but I don't know what it is, so I won't bother. So, conclusion. It seems that the Aristotelian tradition and the post-Cartesian one are not in conflict. And they are both right. Neither intellect nor sensation can be treated materialistically. But they are not two separate problems for materialists. There's a sense in which the ancients and the medievals were correct, that it's intellect that dominates this argument. For it is the recognition of form or universals that unites both arguments. At the same time, it cannot be denied that it is the irreducibility of subjectivity, the sensation bit, as found in sensation, that's the clearest sign of the impossibility of materialism. I also believe that there is a further indication of immaterialism, or idealism, or the priority of nous, contained in the classical tradition. The very fact that the universe, or cosmos, is in for those kind of reasons. But the world, so far as it instantiates universals, and therefore also laws, also has a similar affinity. That's why materialists have usually had a strongly nominalist instinct. If there really is generality laid out there in the world, does not that make it rather thought-like? Or only thought is meant to possess such features. Whence comes the intelligibility of an insensate world? That's why Armstrong was going out on a limb when he became a realist about universals with his physicalism. Because the normal thing is to be a nominalist. But I can't and won't pursue this further, this thought further here.
Okay, who'd like to start? Paul first.
Oh, I thought that was great. The natural response is just to say, to throw back an error theory and say, well, sure, if there was meaning, you'd be right, but maybe there isn't. And in a way, I think that's what the kind of, I mean, that doesn't help the scientific realist, but it does, that option is out there. You might kind of think that the human self and just appealing to sympathy and not, or maybe even Blackburn, where there is this, the intelligibility reduces to kind of patterns of liking and disliking, doesn't give you real intentionality, but that's precisely the point. There's an error theory. So it's another option. I don't find it attractive, but I think it's there on the table.
Where do we start on that? If you come to something as basic as recognition, when I say that involves grasping universals, that could be put in a very semi-reductive form. Similarities, objective similarities, and being able to see them as such.
Sure.
Now,